He didn't lose everything in a duel or a betrayal. He lost it with a single stroke of ink. Behind closed doors, rumors moved faster than truth. Servants carried secrets heavier than steel. The power slipped away long before anyone dared speak it aloud. A marriage unraveled. An estate shifted. A legacy decayed without a drop of blood. Tonight, you will walk beside him as the quiet machinery of Tudor ruin begins to turn. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a stranger had paused outside a Tudor manor at first light, he might have mistaken the stillness for certainty. The stone walls stood firm. The banners hung undisturbed. And inside, the household stirred according to routine that had existed for generations. Nothing about the scene suggested fragility. Nothing suggested that a man standing could unravel without a single blade drawn. In Tudor England, honor was not decorative. It was structural. A man's reputation determined how contracts were signed, how alliances were formed, and how obedience was maintained. Land did not merely belong to him. It testified on his behalf. The size of his estate reflected not only wealth but credibility. His name carried legal weight, and that weight influenced how others calculated risk in dealing with him. The husband functioned as the legal anchor of the household. Property transferred through his authority. Tenants paid rent under his seal. Servants obeyed because custom and law reinforced his command. Even his wife's public identity was absorbed into his. Marriage did not create partnership in the modern sense. It consolidated control. The law recognized his oversight as natural, almost inevitable. From a distance, this structure appeared invulnerable. The great hall, with its long table and heavy chairs, seemed to embody permanence. Portraits of ancestors looked down in silent approval. Documents stored in chests bore wax seals, hardened into symbols of continuity. Everything suggested endurance. Yet endurance depended on perception. Unlike military defeat, which occurred in a visible conflict, the scandal operated in smaller movements. It did not require an invasion. It required observation. A man who mismanaged funds, who favoured a mistress too openly, or who quarrelled recklessly in public did not immediately lose land. Instead, he lost certainty in how others interpreted him. That shift was subtle, almost polite. In Tudor society, reputation travelled through corridors faster than official proclamations. Servants overheard conversations. Stewards examined ledgers. Neighbours noted patterns. What seemed private rarely remained so. The household was a network of witnesses. Even silence could be interpreted. It is tempting to imagine that power, in this era, rested entirely on force. Yet force was rarely necessary when belief was intact. Tenants complied because they trusted stability. Allies cooperated because they assumed reliability. Once doubt entered that arrangement, authority weakened from within. The man remained seated at the head of the table, but the atmosphere changed around him. Consider the difference between defeat in battle and damage to reputation. A battlefield loss might be redeemed by courage in another campaign. It offered an opportunity for visible correction. Scandal offered no such clarity. It lingered. It attached itself to memory. It reshaped how every action was perceived afterward. In practical terms, a scandal could interrupt inheritance negotiations, delay dowry arrangements, and complicate credit agreements. Merchants hesitated to extend loans. Relatives reconsidered marriage alliances. Even small hesitations accumulate into isolation. No dramatic announcement marked this transition. It occurred through absence. Fewer invitations. Shorter conversations. and colder greetings. If compared to modern experience, it would resemble a respected executive whose emails begin to receive slower replies. Meetings continue, but confidence evaporates. No accusation is spoken aloud. Yet trust declines quietly. In Tudor England, such a decline carried material consequences. Credit depended on honor. Honor depended on consensus. The husband's role as the legal pillar of the family intensified this vulnerability. Because he embodied authority, any suspicion attached directly to the entire household. A rumor of cruelty suggested instability. A whisper of debt suggested incompetence. Even unproven allegations left residue. The law might not convict him, but society might already have judged him. What makes this dynamic unsettling is its invisibility. A man could rise each morning believing himself secure, unaware that conversations about him had shifted tone. The great hall still echoed with footsteps. The silver still gleamed. Yet something intangible had altered. Tudor culture valued masculinity defined by restraint, order, and governance. A husband who appeared unable to control his household signaled weakness. Weakness invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited a formal complaint. And once a formal complaint began, the machinery of law could engage with precision. It is easy, in hindsight, to assume that men in such a system held absolute protection. The statutes favored them. The courts recognized their dominance. But dominance required performance. It required the continuous affirmation of those watching. Without that affirmation, legal privilege felt thinner. Honor functioned like a collective agreement. As long as the community believed in it, it operated efficiently. When belief faltered, the same structure that upheld authority could expose its gaps. Land could not argue. Titles could not defend themselves. Reputation filled those spaces. Scandal, therefore, possessed a unique power. It did not need violence. It did not need a spectacle. It needed patience and observation. Once activated, it destabilized faster than military loss. A defeated general might still command respect. A compromised husband might lose it entirely. The quiet danger lay in the assumption of permanence. The man at the center of the household assumed that property and law guaranteed continuity. He underestimated how deeply his authority relied on interpretation. The stone walls did not protect him from opinion. The sealed documents did not silence witnesses. And so, the foundations of downfall were laid long before any formal accusation emerged. The environment was prepared by expectation. Society demanded steadiness. Any deviation invites commentary. Commentary prepared the ground for action. Honor in Tudor England appeared inseparable from land and law. Yet it depended on the fragile agreement of those observing it. Once that agreement weakened, authority began to erode without visible conflict. And when erosion becomes measurable, the very system designed to protect a husband can begin to examine him instead. The Tudor legal system stood quietly behind every household. Like scaffolding, no one noticed until something began to lean. It did not intrude into daily meals or morning prayers. Yet it structured them all the same. Marriage, property, and inheritance each rested upon statutes written in careful ink, guarded by clerks who valued order more than sympathy. Marriage law in Tudor England tilted decisively toward men. Upon union, a wife's legal identity narrowed. Her movable goods, her income, and even elements of her dowry passed under her husband's administration. He did not merely share authority, he absorbed it. In public dealings, her presence was often represented through him. This arrangement created the impression of unity, but it also created an imbalance. At first glance, such an imbalance appeared protective. A husband could rely on a presumption. Courts assumed his managerial competence unless proven otherwise. Property disputes tended to privilege his interpretation of contracts. Even in cases of marital tension, he began with an advantage. Yet advantage is not immunity. The same marriage contracts that transferred control also recorded expectations. Dowry agreements specified financial obligations. Settlements outlined protections for heirs. Wills described intended succession. These documents existed not for moments of harmony, but for moments of rupture. They waited quietly for the dispute. When disagreement surfaced, it moved toward ecclesiastical courts. These institutions governed moral and marital matters. Their authority derived not from brute force, but from religious legitimacy. A vow made before God carried consequences beyond domestic discomfort. To violate that vow invited formal scrutiny. Ecclesiastical hearings rarely resembled a spectacle. They unfolded in chambers where testimony was transcribed methodically. Questions were posed in restrained language. Accusations were examined for consistency rather than drama. The atmosphere felt procedural, almost restrained, which made its effect more enduring. Allegations of adultery did not require public confession to inflict damage. Suspicion alone, once entered into record, altered perception. A husband defending himself against a moral charge found his authority repositioned. Instead of commanding obedience, he explained conduct. Litigation in Tudor society functioned as a discrete battleground. There were no swords drawn, no blood-staining stone floors. Instead, parchment accumulated. Letters were preserved rather than destroyed. Financial ledgers were reviewed with new attention. Witnesses recalled details that once seemed trivial. Servants, often underestimated, became critical participants. Their observations carried weight when corroborated. A late return from travel, unusual expenditures, altered patterns of domestic presence. These fragments, when arranged, formed a narrative. What made litigation particularly dangerous was its duration. A single confrontation might resolve swiftly. A prolonged inquiry lingered. While proceedings advanced slowly, rumor traveled faster. Associates reconsidered alliances. Creditors monitored accounts. Relatives advised caution. The husband who believed the law reinforced his supremacy began to experience law as exposure. Property disputes intensified vulnerability. Tudor estates depended on careful management. Misallocation of funds, especially toward a mistress, threatened more than personal reputation. It signaled instability in stewardship. Stability reassured tenants and partners. Instability invited replacement. Temporary restrictions imposed by courts. Limitations on transferring assets. And requirements to clarify accounts appeared administrative. Yet their symbolic meaning was unmistakable. Authority was under review. Modern parallels can be drawn to regulatory audits that do not immediately accuse but require disclosure. The act of answering questions shifts power. The investigated party must justify rather than command. Confidence diminishes, not through verdict, but through process. The ecclesiastical system compounded this shift by framing disputes in moral language. A husband accused of cruelty or infidelity was not simply negligent, he was spiritually compromised. Spiritual compromise carried communal implications. Parish networks transmitted awareness quietly. Litigation, therefore, became a silent theatre. Each side assembled an argument. Each document carried a potential consequence. Public confrontation remained unnecessary. The existence of a formal complaint alone destabilized. It is important to note that the law did not always condemn husbands. Many cases concluded without a dramatic penalty. But even dismissal could not fully erase the period of scrutiny. The memory of the examination lingered in social consciousness. The imbalance that once favored men became double-edged. Because the husband embodied legal authority, any challenge to his conduct resonated widely. He did not stand as an individual. He stood as a representative of household governance. To question him was to question structure. Thus, litigation operated as containment. It did not require overthrow. It required pressure applied through formal channels. Quiet persistence often proved more effective than public scandal. The transformation was gradual. The man remained seated at the head of the table. His name still appeared on documents. Yet confidence around him altered. Servants listened differently. Relatives advised differently. Conversations shifted tone. Law, which once seemed to affirm permanence, revealed itself as a mechanism. Mechanism could reinforce, but it could also restrain. The difference lay in who initiated the procedure. In Tudor England, control depended not only on possession of rights, but on the ability to prevent those rights from being examined. Once the examination began, the hierarchy adjusted. The legal system favoured husbands, yet it preserved every obligation alongside every privilege. When marital and moral disputes entered the ecclesiastical record, authority moved from assumption to documentation, and in a world where parchment outweighed pride, litigation could wound more deeply than open conflict. Marriage in Tudor England rarely began with romance. It began with negotiation. Families examined maps before they examined temperaments. Acres of land, titles attached to those acres, and the alliances that might follow mattered more than affection. A wedding was not merely a ceremony beneath stained glass. It was a transaction written into the geography of power. Land formed the spine of Tudor authority. Estates defined status, and status dictated influence. When two families arranged a marriage, they were not uniting only individuals. They were binding territories. Fields that had once stood separate could, through careful contract, become part of a larger domain. Boundaries shifted not by invasion, but by dowry. The bride carried more than garments into her husband's household. She carried capital. Dowry agreements were meticulously recorded, specifying sums of money, parcels of land, or rights to future inheritance. These provisions were not symbolic. They were calculated investments. In exchange, the husband promised security, legitimacy for heirs, and preservation of the alliance. Such arrangements reinforced stability. A well-matched marriage could transform rivals into relatives. Disputes over grazing rights or debts softened when blood ties existed. Political loyalty often flowed through kinship networks. A man strengthened his position not only by expanding property, but by expanding obligation. Yet this consolidation created dependence, because marriage unified estates. It also entangled fortunes. The husband's authority over property was significant, but it was not absolute in intention. Many settlements included safeguards ensuring that, if the marriage failed or the husband mismanaged assets, portions of wealth could revert or be protected for heirs. These clauses lay dormant during harmony. But they waited. The wife's familial network remained present even after she entered her husband's hall. Brothers monitored how she was treated. Fathers reviewed financial performance. Letters travelled between households. Reporting conditions. Marriage did not sever her from her origin. It extended her family's influence into a new estate. This extension could be reassuring. It could also become leverage. When separation threatened, consequences extended beyond personal disappointment. A rupture in marriage unsettled alliances carefully built. Dowries might be contested. Land transfers could be reviewed. Political loyalties recalculated. What appeared domestic was, in fact, strategic. A husband who alienated his wife did not merely risk emotional discord. He risked destabilizing contracts that underpinned his estate's legitimacy. If her kin withdrew support, creditors might reconsider confidence. Tenants observing discord might question continuity. Even subtle signals mattered. It is tempting to imagine that separation functioned as a private arrangement. In reality, it represented a public fracture. Negotiations for annulment or legal separation exposed financial records. They invited scrutiny of dowry agreements and inheritance plans. Each clause became subject to interpretation. Modern parallels can be drawn to corporate mergers, unraveling under dispute. Assets are reassessed. Partnerships renegotiated. Confidence fluctuates. In Tudor England. However, the stakes included lineage itself. Heirs depended on a stable union. Questions about legitimacy rippled outward. The political dimension of marriage intensified vulnerability during the scandal. If a husband's misconduct, financial or moral, became widely known, the wife's family might intervene not out of sentiment, but out of strategic preservation. Protecting dowry and reputation served broader interests. They might petition courts, initiate audits, or demand formal clarification of rights. Such interventions rarely occurred dramatically. They unfolded through correspondence and quiet consultation with legal advisors. Yet their effect could be profound. A man who once viewed marriage as a consolidation of power began to recognize it as a network of oversight. The presence of a mistress complicated matters further. Financial resources directed toward her risked violating settlement terms. Emotional favoritism threatened alliance perception, even if no formal charge arose. Tension circulated. The wife's kin might interpret extravagance as mismanagement. Political allies might perceive a distraction. Because Tudor society intertwined private conduct with public authority, marital instability translated into political uncertainty. A lord whose domestic affairs appeared chaotic projected unreliability. Rival families could exploit that perception, positioning themselves as steadier alternatives. Separation, therefore, equated to a crisis beyond the bedroom. It signaled a fracture within alliance structures. Contracts, once viewed as protective, could become instruments of constraint. Dowry clauses might limit property transfer. Guardianship arrangements might restrict paternal authority over heirs. The husband remained the nominal head of household. Yet if the alliance underpinning his marriage weakened, his standing shifted. Land secured through union could become contested ground. Credit extended on the assumption of stable kinship could tighten. What is striking is how marriage, initially designed to fortify power, contained the seeds of its own destabilization. Its political nature ensured that any disturbance reverberated outward. The ceremony that once symbolized expansion could, under strain, expose fragility. In this context, separation did not require public condemnation to inflict harm. The mere acknowledgement of discord unsettled alliances. Observers recalculated loyalties quietly. Even reconciliation carried residue. Marriage in Tudor England was never merely personal. It was architecture, constructed to support estates and alliances. But architecture depends on balance. When one beam shifts, pressure redistributes. The husband who believed himself strengthened by union might discover that union also bound him to scrutiny. Dowry agreements preserved expectations. Kinship networks preserved memory. Political advantage required careful maintenance. Marriage consolidated land and loyalty. Yet, it intertwined authority with obligation. When dowry, alliance, and inheritance entered dispute, private discord became public recalculation. In a society where union determined power, the fracture of marriage could unsettle far more than affection. Scandal in Tudor England did not arrive on horseback. It did not thunder through gates or declare itself beneath banners. It entered quietly, folded inside parchment, sealed with wax, and delivered with the calm courtesy of formal address. Those who expected conflict to announce itself with raised voices often missed the moment it began. No public violence was required to destabilize a man of standing. No confrontation in the courtyard. No broken glass in the great hall. A single petition, submitted at the correct time, carried greater precision than any blade. Its power lay not in spectacle, but in record. A written complaint altered the nature of authority immediately. What had been a rumor became an allegation. What had been whispered among servants became subject to procedure. The husband who once dismissed murmurs as trivial found himself named within official language. His conduct, once interpreted socially, was now examined legally. The shift from speech to script mattered deeply. Words spoken could be denied or forgotten. Words written were preserved. Clerks copied them carefully. Archives retained them beyond the lifespan of emotion. Ink extended memory. It is difficult to overstate how destabilizing documentation could be. A man accustomed to commanding conversation suddenly faced text that did not yield to tone or intimidation. The parchment did not respond to anger. It required response in kind. Measured, articulated, and defensible. Petitions were often framed with restraint. They did not accuse recklessly. They listed concerns. Financial irregularities, moral failings, neglect of obligation. Each sentence appeared modest. Together, they constructed doubt. The absence of violence created an illusion of normalcy. Meals continued. Servants performed duties. Visitors arrived. Yet beneath routine, tension recalibrated. Those aware of the filing adjusted behavior. Conversations shortened. Observations sharpened. The brilliance of paper lay in timing. A complaint submitted during visible prosperity invited scrutiny. A petition lodged during financial strain intensified vulnerability. The law favored those who understood sequence. The right moment amplified the effect. In many cases, the petitioner did not require certainty of victory. The objective was exposure. Once proceedings began, the husband entered a space he did not fully control. Hearings generated a transcript. Transcript generated awareness. Awareness generated commentary. Modern analogies exist in formal audits or legal notices that appear understated yet initiate cascading consequences. The envelope itself alters the atmosphere. Confidence shifts before any ruling occurs. The Tudor husband often believed his social stature would insulate him from such mechanisms. Yet stature invited visibility. Visibility invited record. The higher the standing, the more significant the petition appeared. There was something almost surgical about the process. A single document inserted into legal machinery created motion. Motion produced a requirement. The requirement produced a response. Each response entered further records. The cycle expanded without a dramatic announcement. Family members reacted cautiously. Allies assessed the distance. Even loyal friends hesitated to align publicly with uncertainty. Reputation did not collapse instantly. It thinned. The phrase loss of honor suggests sudden disgrace. Reality proved more gradual. Honor fractured internally before it appeared externally. The man himself might sense subtle alteration. Deference less automatic. Eye contact less steady. And assurances less confident. Paper accomplished what confrontation could not. It legitimized suspicion. It removed conflict from private negotiation and placed it under institutional gaze. Once that gaze fixed upon a household, nothing remained entirely private. It is unsettling to imagine standing in a Tudor chamber while a clerk reads aloud from a complaint. The language remains controlled. The tone remains formal. Yet with each line, authority redistributes. The husband listens not as commander, but as subject. The sword threatened the body. Paper threatened permanence. Even if the complaint failed, its existence lingered. The record remained accessible. Future disputes could reference it. Past accusations never fully vanished. It rested quietly, awaiting revival. This was how the scandal began. Not through dramatic betrayal, but through administrative action. Those who underestimated parchment misunderstood power. In Tudor society, writing preserved memory more effectively than rumour alone. The household might appear unchanged to casual observers. Candles burned. Meals were served. Fields were tended. Yet the internal balance shifted. Once legal scrutiny commenced, Confidence required a defense rather than an assumption. Scandal without blood proved more enduring than conflict with witnesses. It penetrated structures rather than surfaces. It demanded patience rather than bravery. Public violence was unnecessary when documentation could legitimize doubt. A single petition, placed precisely, transformed rumor into recorded allegation. From that moment, honor no longer rested on silence, but on survival within written scrutiny. Silence in a Tudor household was rarely empty. It carried intention. In great halls, where voices once defined authority, restraint could become more powerful than protest. A wife who chose not to confront openly did not necessarily accept defeat. She observed. Unlike her husband, she did not rely on the assumption of dominance. Her position required calculation. Because the law tilted toward male control, she understood that visible anger might weaken her standing. Composure, by contrast, invited credibility. In disputes of morality or finance, credibility mattered more than volume. The Tudor household functioned as a network of witnesses. Servants moved between chambers, kitchens, and courtyards. They noticed irregularities long before masters acknowledged them. A wife who maintained a quiet rapport with her staff possessed access to information her husband often underestimated. She did not demand a confession. She encouraged detail. Small observations accumulated. Unusual expenditures recorded by the steward. Letters delivered discreetly at twilight. Jewelry purchased without explanation. None of these details alone secured an advantage. Together, they formed a pattern. Pattern, when documented, carried persuasive force. The act of recording became central. Ledgers were reviewed carefully. Household accounts copied or compared. Correspondence preserved instead of discarded. A letter that might once have been burned could now serve as evidence of misdirected loyalty or financial imprudence. It is tempting to interpret such behavior as manipulation. In the Tudor context, it was survival within constraints. Open accusation risked dismissal. Quiet preparation ensured leverage. The wife's strategy relied on patience. She allowed her husband to continue believing himself unobserved. Publicly, she maintained dignity. At feasts, she greeted guests with steadiness. In church, she occupied her place without visible tension. This outward composure shielded her from claims of hysteria or instability. Accusations frequently directed at women who protested too forcefully. Meanwhile, documentation expanded quietly. Servants could be persuaded not with threats, but with assurance of protection. Loyalty to the household often exceeded loyalty to an individual master. If financial mismanagement threatened wages or stability, testimony aligned naturally with preservation. The wife positioned herself as guardian of continuity. The transformation of silence into a legal instrument required timing. Evidence gathered prematurely might dissipate. Evidence presented at the right moment could reshape proceedings. She waited for vulnerability. Perhaps during an existing petition. Perhaps during scrutiny from ecclesiastical authorities. When documentation entered formal channels, her prior restraint strengthened her position. She appeared measured, reasonable, and concerned for order rather than revenge. The contrast between quiet preparation and documented irregularity altered perception. Modern parallels can be found in strategic corporate audits initiated internally before public exposure. Preparation determines leverage. Information determines negotiation power. The husband, accustomed to visible authority, often misread quiet as submission. He underestimated accumulation. He mistook the absence of confrontation for the absence of action. By the time he recognized the pattern, it had already been preserved. Silence also protected her reputation. In Tudor society, a woman who aired grievances publicly risked social censure. By maintaining composure, She avoided appearing disruptive. When proceedings began, observers could not easily accuse her of impulsiveness. Financial records proved particularly potent. Household expenditures reflected priority. Funds diverted toward a mistress signaled not merely infidelity, but mismanagement. Mismanagement threatened estate stability. Stability concerns extended family and tenants alike. Letters carried equal force. Affection expressed in ink contradicted public denial. Promises recorded privately could be read aloud formally. Once spoken in court, intimacy transformed into liability. What makes this strategy remarkable is its subtlety. No raised voice signaled resistance. No dramatic declaration disrupted routine. The wife moved through familiar spaces. Attentive, composed, deliberate. Silence, therefore, was not absence. It was construction. In legal disputes, the perception of motive influenced the outcome. A wife who presented evidence without overt hostility appeared protective of household integrity. A husband reacting defensively risked reinforcing suspicion. The court valued coherence. The domestic sphere, often dismissed as secondary, became ground for strategic observation. Kitchens, accounting rooms, and corridors functioned as sites of intelligence gathering. The wife understood the terrain intimately. She required no battlefield. This transformation of private awareness into formal leverage altered hierarchy. The husband who believed documentation favored him encountered documentation arranged against him. Not fabricated, arranged. It is unsettling to consider how power shifts without spectacle. One moment, authority appears intact. The next, it is contingent upon explanation. The wife's silence ensured that when confrontation occurred, it rested on prepared ground. She did not need to shout to be heard. She needed a record, and record, once presented, carried authority that emotion could not dismiss. Silence concealed observation, and observation accumulated into proof. What seemed like patience was preparation structured through detail. When quiet documentation replaces confrontation, control changes hands without a single raised voice. A mistress did not always arrive as a scandal. At first, she appeared as an ornament, an indulgence tolerated within certain circles, whispered about but rarely confronted directly. Tudor society was not naive about male desire. Discretion, not purity, preserved reputation. As long as indulgence remained contained, order appeared intact. The difficulty began when containment failed. Public appearance altered perception immediately. A mistress who was seen too often at gatherings, who received gifts too visibly, who occupied space once reserved for the wife, unsettled the architecture of hierarchy. The household functioned on clear lines. Once those lines blurred, observers recalculated. Visibility invited interpretation. Servants noticed seating arrangements. Guests measured proximity. The wife's composure was examined for cracks. Even the smallest gesture, a shared glance, a hand lingering too long, carried symbolic weight. The mistress, once peripheral, became central in conversation. In Tudor England, perception was currency. When a husband displayed preference too openly, he appeared governed by appetite rather than judgment. Appetite suggested instability. Instability suggested risk. The transformation from private indulgence to public complication occurred gradually. At first, the mistress might be introduced under a vague description to a distant relation, a companion, or a dependent. Yet repeated presence weakened such fiction. Patterns formed. Observers compared stories. Doubt accumulated. Pregnancy intensified everything. An illegitimate pregnancy did not merely offend moral expectations. It complicated inheritance. Tudor estates depended upon clarity of succession. Legitimate heirs secured continuity. Ambiguity threatened fragmentation. A mistress carrying a child introduced a question into what had once seemed certain. The legal distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children was clear. Yet social reality proved messier. If the husband acknowledged the child privately or provided financial support, the rumor expanded. If he denied the child publicly while continuing a visible association with the mother, contradiction emerged. Inheritance negotiations were rarely isolated from reputation. A man accused of diverting estate resources toward a mistress and her child risked appearing negligent toward lawful heirs. Law might protect legitimacy, but perception influences political trust. The wife's position grew more precarious, yet paradoxically stronger in strategy. The mistress's visibility validated suspicion. What might once have been dismissed as rumor acquired evidence, financial transfers toward the mistress could now be scrutinized. Letters gained new significance. Silence within the household felt heavier. Family networks did not remain passive. The wife's kin observed the situation with strategic concern. Dowry agreements might be endangered if estate funds are shifted. Brothers and uncles evaluated whether intervention was required to preserve the investment. Protection of lineage transcended personal resentment. The husband's relatives also reacted. Some urged discretion to prevent escalation. Others feared fragmentation of land if conflict intensified. The presence of a mistress threatened not only domestic harmony, but collective stability. It is striking how quickly personal desire became political tension. What began as indulgence transformed into a catalyst. The mistress herself might possess little direct power, yet her existence exposed fractures within the established order. Modern parallels can be found in leadership scandals, where private relationships intersect with corporate governance. The issue ceases to be affectionate and becomes a conflict of interest. Confidence erodes, not because desire exists, but because it appears to override responsibility. In Tudor households, responsibility defined masculinity. A husband was expected to maintain balance, desire managed within discretion, authority exercised with prudence. Visible disruption suggested weakness of discipline. As pregnancy advanced, speculation intensified. Questions about support, recognition, and future provision entered the conversation, even if the child held no legal claim to inheritance. Emotional attachment could influence resource allocation. Observers feared misjudgment. The wife, maintaining composure, required no accusation. The mistress's condition spoke visibly. Every gathering carried tension. Every absence of the husband signaled alignment. When kin intervened, they rarely did so dramatically. Letters were sent. Legal advisors consulted. Financial records reviewed. Intervention appeared protective rather than confrontational. Yet its presence altered the balance. The husband, who once believed himself master of narrative, discovered that narrative now included others. The mistress, unintentionally or not, amplified scrutiny. Her existence connected personal appetite to institutional vulnerability. What makes this dynamic unsettling is its inevitability. Once visibility exceeded discretion, the crisis expanded without overt declaration. No sword was drawn, no decree issued, yet alliances recalculated, and loyalties shifted. The mistress functioned less as an enemy and more as an accelerant. She did not create instability alone. She revealed it. Where trust had thinned, her presence exposed weakness. Where finances had been strained, her support highlighted mismanagement. Desire, once private, became evidence of imbalance. The household remained outwardly intact. Meals were served, fields harvested, visitors received. Yet beneath routine, tension crystallized around succession and loyalty. The husband's authority depended on the perception of prudence. Prudence now stood questioned. A single visible relationship could destabilize years of careful alliance. A pregnancy could transform rumour into a structural concern. Family intervention, once activated, ensured that private indulgence evolved into a political crisis. The mistress did not need a formal accusation to disrupt stability. Her visibility connected desire to inheritance, and inheritance to power. When personal indulgence collides with lineage, scrutiny spreads beyond the chamber into the entire estate. In Tudor England, morality did not live quietly in private chambers. It lived in law, in sermons, in the expectations of neighbours who measured virtue as carefully as they measured harvest yields. A man did not simply belong to himself. He belonged to a moral order that claimed authority over his household, his marriage, and even his impulses. When that order shifted its gaze toward him, accusation took a form more enduring than anger recorded. Repeated, and rarely forgotten, adultery occupied a position of particular gravity. It was not framed as a merely personal failing, but as a breach of Christian duty. Marriage was sanctified before God, and to violate that vow invited ecclesiastical intervention. For a husband who believed himself entitled to indiscretion, this posed a quiet threat. Tudor courts did not require dramatic evidence. They required consistency, a pattern of late returns, the presence of a mistress, and financial gifts, unaccounted, for each element fed suspicion. The danger lay in the transformation of suspicion into record. Once testimony was inscribed by clerks, adultery became a matter for clerical judgment rather than household debate. A man accustomed to dismissing household gossip discovered that the same details, once documented, demanded response. His silence could be interpreted as evasion. His anger could be interpreted as guilt. Moral accusation blurred into financial accusation with striking ease. Misuse of shared property, whether coins redirected to a mistress or goods transferred without explanation, constituted breach of stewardship. The Tudor household was both domestic and an economic unit. A husband who diverted resources threatened not only his wife's security, but the stability of agreements connecting multiple families. Dowries anchored alliances. Joint assets supported tenant arrangements. When money disappeared, it unsettled more than marital harmony. Investigators examined the ledgers with methodical attention. Missing sums, inflated expenses, discrepancies between purchases and inventory. None of these needed a dramatic scale to imply misconduct. Mismanagement suggested a lack of discipline. A man unable to govern his own accounts seemed poorly suited to govern land, or servants, or alliances. Financial irregularity thus complemented moral accusation, each reinforcing the other. Domestic violence, though often concealed behind thick stone walls, could also enter the public sphere through testimony. Servants knew the rhythms of the household. They recognized when a door slammed differently, when a wife withdrew from gatherings, when bruises appeared beneath sleeves, while physical harm might go unacknowledged for months. A formal inquiry brought these observations into light. The ecclesiastical court did not treat cruelty as a private matter. It framed it as a violation of marital obligation. For a man accustomed to control, the exposure of violence proved especially destabilizing. Authority, in Tudor expectation, required restraint. A husband who beat his wife revealed a loss of discipline. Discipline was the foundation of masculine legitimacy. Without it, authority appeared unworthy. What made moral accusation uniquely potent was its cumulative nature. Each charge adultery, financial misuse, cruelty did not stand alone. Together, they constructed a narrative of character. A man who failed morally might also fail economically. A man who failed economically might resort to cruelty. Observers connected dots before the court did. Reputation eroded before judgment formed. Modern parallels exist in public scandals where personal misconduct intersects with professional integrity. A single allegation may not destroy credibility, but a pattern shifts perception irrevocably. In Tudor England, This shift operated within smaller, tighter communities where memory circulated through both rumor and written record. Witnesses played decisive roles. Servants spoke from proximity. Relatives spoke from obligation. Clerics spoke from doctrine. The husband's voice, once dominant, became one voice among many. Even denial lost force when weighed against multiple testimonies. The law sought coherence, not dramatic confession. It is unsettling to imagine how quietly this transformation occurred. A man could wake believing himself secure, unaware that statements had already been recorded about him. His household continued its routines. Meals were served, accounts were presented. Yet beneath that surface, the narrative of his character had begun shifting towards scrutiny. Accusation did not require spectacle. It required accumulation. A wife who preserved letters. Servants who recalled details. Stewards who tracked expenditures all contributed strands to a legal framework that interpreted moral failing as breach of duty. Once proceedings began, the husband no longer defended individual acts. He defended the coherence of his identity. The danger deepened because moral accusation touched every aspect of patriarchal legitimacy. A man who violated sacred vows undermined spiritual authority. A man who misused shared assets undermined economic authority. A man who inflicted violence undermined domestic authority. When all three threads intertwined, the entire structure of his position strained. Even if he managed to rebut one allegation, others persisted. Law did not require perfection. It required plausibility. A husband who denied adultery might struggle to deny expenditures. A husband who denied violence might struggle to explain witnesses' accounts. Credibility, once fractured, is rarely repaired fully. The household, once a symbol of stability, became a theatre of investigation. Servants walked carefully. The wife moved with purpose, concealed behind composure. The husband sensed eyes upon him, yet did not always know which details had already been recorded. In many cases, the accusation itself inflicted more damage than the outcome. Even if the court refrained from severe penalties, the memory of proceedings lingered, affecting alliances, negotiations, and social relations. A stain of moral suspicion did not wash away through the verdict. What began as a whisper of impropriety evolved into a documented narrative. What seemed like a private misjudgment became a breach of communal expectation. When morality turned into evidence, a man's authority could falter without a single act of open rebellion. Adultery transformed from rumor into clerical record. Binding desire to spiritual violation. Financial misuse revealed fractures in stewardship that touched every corner of the estate. Once cruelty, expense, and infidelity aligned, moral accusation became a force capable of reshaping the entire household hierarchy. A vow in Tudor England was not gentle poetry spoken for affection. It was a binding declaration placed under the gaze of God, witnessed by clergy, affirmed by ritual, and preserved as a moral anchor for the entire community. When a marriage vow fractured, even slightly, the rupture did not remain quiet. It travelled outward, carried by those whose duty was to examine the sacred bond and determine where fault, weakness, or deceit had entered. Once, ecclesiastical authorities became involved. The boundary between private life and public order dissolved. A household no longer belonged solely to those who lived within its walls. It became subject to clerical interpretation. The couple's promises, once spoken in hope, were now read critically, line by line, as though they were contracts in dispute. The ceremony that once held candles and hymns now resurfaced as evidence. Priests approached such cases with detachment shaped by doctrine. They listened not for passion but for breach. They compared testimony to expectation, obligation to fulfillment. The language of spirituality merged with the language of regulation. A husband who believed marriage granted him unchecked authority learned that authority was conditional. A wife who once felt powerless discovered that her vow gave her standing. If she could demonstrate its violation, lawyers, often consulted alongside clergy, introduced another layer of scrutiny. Their interest was not spiritual harmony, but precedent, consistency, and procedural accuracy. They traced financial obligations, reviewed dowry terms, examined correspondence, and interpreted behavior through legal frameworks. The marriage, once held together by affection or routine, became a structure evaluated for fault lines. Together, clergy and legal advisors replaced the symbols of traditional conflict. Steel and shields mattered little compared to parchment, testimony, and clerical judgment. A dispute that might once have culminated in physical confrontation evolved instead into an inquiry conducted with quills and records. Violence could be dramatic, analysis was enduring. The involvement of ecclesiastical authorities changed not only the couple's dynamic, but the environment surrounding them. Servants spoke more carefully. Relatives offered counsel rooted in caution rather than confidence. Tensions thickened in hallways, where each word might become part of a larger narrative, if overheard and repeated. What made this scrutiny particularly unsettling was its methodical nature. The clergy did not seek spectacle. They sought clarity. Each inconsistency mattered. A forgotten date, a contradiction in testimony, a letter written in haste. The couple, once united before an altar, now stood on opposite sides of interpretation. For the husband, this shift often felt like a loss of command. His identity as moral leader of the household was not assumed. It had to be demonstrated. For the wife, the inquiry offered a rare opportunity. Her silence, her documentation, and her composure. Each could now function as evidence of integrity. When her claims aligned with clerical expectations of marital duty, her voice gained strength. Meanwhile, the public listened. Whispers grew not from curiosity alone, but from recognition that marriage represented more than private intimacy. It represented continuity of property, stability of alliances, and legitimacy of heirs. When a marriage entered dispute, it signaled vulnerability within structures that communities relied upon. People gossiped not merely to judge, but to recalibrate their expectations. Markets, inns, and parish grounds became sites where fragments of the story circulated. A servant's report, repeated at a tavern, evolved into speculation. A relative's visit inspired conjecture. Even without official announcements, the atmosphere shifted. Those who once regarded the couple with respect now watched with interest, sharpened by moral expectation and social caution. The public's involvement created pressure that neither clergy nor lawyers needed to enforce. Reputation became part of the case. A man entering a church under suspicion sensed the weight of eyes. A wife attending service alone invited questions. Perception, once peripheral, now shapes the direction of inquiry. In this environment, truth mattered less than coherence. The side whose narrative aligned more naturally with moral teaching held an advantage. Clergy valued duty. Lawyers valued consistency. The public valued appearance. The husband and wife, caught between these forces, discovered that the vow they once exchanged now acted as a framework for judgment. The vow had been spoken in trust. Now it was dissected in search of fault. And once the vow became an object of examination, neither party could control how deeply its fractures were traced. A marriage no longer belonged to the two when the church began to examine its promise. Clergy and legal counsel replaced weapons with questions that pierced far deeper than steel. As whispers spread through the community, the couple learned that public judgment moved faster than any ruling handed down by the court. The ecclesiastical courts of Tudor England operated with a calm that disguised their influence. They did not assemble crowds. They did not summon trumpets or display chains. Instead, they proceeded in modest chambers, where wooden tables ink pots, and clerks shaped outcomes far more enduring than any battlefield victory. Their strength lay in duration. A single hearing changed little. A prolonged series of inquiries reshaped reputations. Interrogations were conducted quietly. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Only measured questions intended to reveal consistency or fracture. Each session felt uneventful in isolation. Yet repetition wore down certainty. Husbands, accustomed to commanding attention, found themselves answering to a cleric who neither feared them nor flattered them. Wives who had spent years in silence discovered that their restraint now worked to their advantage. The court valued composure, not passion. The length of the process inflicted its own pressure. Weeks became months. Testimonies accumulated. Documents multiplied. Each new request for clarification reminded the household that scrutiny had not lifted. A man could endure accusation for a day. Enduring suspicion for a season eroded confidence in ways more subtle and more permanent. Witnesses often emerged from the domestic sphere. Servants who swept corridors, tended fires, and managed linens knew rhythms of the household better than its masters. They observed late-night arrivals, closed doors, altered financial habits, and emotional distance long before such patterns reached public rumour. Ecclesiastical courts recognized this proximity. Their testimonies carried weight not because of status, but because of constancy. Relatives, too, provided testimony, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes strategically. A wife's brother might speak to protect dowry integrity. An uncle might recount prior conflict. Their words entered the record with authority derived from family duty rather than impartiality. Each witness contributed a fragment, and the fragments formed a narrative. What made this process so dangerous for a husband was its quiet accumulation. No single statement destroyed him. Instead, small details, an unexplained expense, a servant's recollection, a relative's hesitation, layered themselves into a coherent story. The court sought neither drama nor confession. It sought structure. Structure, once assembled, held persuasive force. Reputation eroded slowly. At first, the decline was invisible. A missed invitation from a neighbouring estate might be dismissed as a coincidence. A friend's distant greeting might be attributed to preoccupation. But patterns emerged. Conversations shortened. Advisors suggested caution. Allies became careful with their endorsements. Reputation, once firm, began to thin like worn cloth. The ecclesiastical court did not publicly declare moral collapse. It did not need to. Its inquiries triggered speculation, and speculation spread more quickly than official rulings. People spoke not of verdicts, but of questions being asked. The fact that a man was under moral examination altered how he was seen, even before conclusions were reached. This shift in perception reached the household first. Servants grew cautious. They responded with formality where warmth once existed. Their awareness that they might be summoned again influenced their behaviour. They avoided complicity. Their distance signalled vulnerability within the structure of authority. For the wife, the court offered an arena where her voice carried new legitimacy. She did not need to accuse. She needed only to align her statements with observable fact. Her steadiness contrasted with her husband's defensiveness. In an environment where restraint equaled credibility, she gained an advantage. Meanwhile, the husband faced a new reality. His authority, once unquestioned, now required explanation. The court did not assume his innocence. It examined him with the same dispassionate scrutiny applied to any subject, regardless of status. He could not command the cleric. He could not dismiss the clerk. Authority shifted from inheritance to evaluation. Modern comparisons can be drawn to regulatory investigations that unfold beyond public view. No immediate punishment is announced. Yet companies decline under the weight of slow inquiry. Investors withdraw. Partners hesitate. Confidence evaporates not through verdict, but through endurance of uncertainty. In Tudor England, the same quiet attrition reshaped the fate of households. It is unsettling to imagine a man attending service in his parish, while knowing that members of the same congregation had heard glimpses of testimony from those he employed. He stood before the altar, attempting dignity. But the silent judgments surrounding him carried more weight than any devotional act. The ecclesiastical courts did not intend humiliation. They intended order. But the order required examination, and the examination left marks. Even if a husband navigated the inquiry without formal condemnation, the memory of scrutiny clung to him. People remembered that he had been questioned, and in a society built on perception, memory functioned as a verdict. Step by step, reputation weakened. Step by step, confidence thinned, and long before judgment was spoken, the moral authority of the household's master had already begun to fade. Interrogation worked slowly, but its persistence reshaped how a man was seen. Witnesses from within the household provided details that accumulated into a narrative. By the time the inquiry ended, reputation had already unravelled quietly, thread by thread. Financial ruin in Tudor England did not erupt loudly. It crept through ink lines, ledger columns, and balances that refused to reconcile. A husband might stride through his estate with the confidence of inherited authority, unaware that the most dangerous threat to his standing lay not outside his gates but within the quiet arithmetic of his own accounts. When scrutiny finally reached his books, the illusion of stability often dissolved far faster than reputation could recover. The audit rarely began as an accusation. It began as a question, posed by a steward, a relative, or a legal advisor, regarding a missing sum or an unexplained payment. In a household with extensive holdings, fluctuations were expected. Yet when discrepancies repeated, patterns emerged, and patterns, once identified, became invitations for deeper inspection. Ledgers revealed more than financial activity. They revealed priority. Expenditures toward estate maintenance appeared disciplined and necessary. Expenditures toward private indulgence, especially those involving a mistress, appeared indulgent and careless. The distinction mattered. One reinforced authority, the other undermined it. A careful reader of accounts could track the emotional geography of a household. Money spent on gifts, clothing, or housing for a mistress pointed to divided loyalty. Funds redirected from household reserves suggested neglect. When these entries appeared beside unpaid debts or delayed tenant payments, suspicion quickened. The estate, once assumed stable, looked increasingly like a structure strained from within. Audits in Tudor society were not always initiated from malice. Sometimes they arose from concern that mismanagement threatened family legacy, that heirs might inherit diminished land, or that alliances connected through marriage might fracture under financial strain. Concern, when formalized, became oversight. Oversight became an investigation. The husband, confronted with questions, often underestimated the seriousness of inquiry. He might dismiss discrepancies as clerical error or seasonal fluctuation, but clerks were trained to detect patterns. They compared entries across months. They checked expenditure against inventory. They examined receipts. The process was slow, deliberate, and increasingly revealing. Once spending on a mistress appeared clearly in financial records, moral suspicion intertwined with economic evidence. The accusation no longer centered solely on desire. It centered on stewardship. A man who misused household assets for personal indulgence jeopardized far more than marital harmony. He jeopardized land, lineage, and the agreements binding families together. What made financial mismanagement so dangerous was its tangibility. Unlike rumours, entries in a ledger could not be dismissed as gossip. Numbers confronted the husband with proof stripped of interpretation. The more he attempted to explain, the deeper the inquiry reached. Emotional defence held no weight against arithmetic. As inconsistencies multiplied, pressure increased. Creditors, once generous due to his reputation, reconsidered terms. Tudor, hearing whispers of instability, hesitated to commit to long leases. Relatives observed from a distance, evaluating whether intervention was necessary to protect the estate. Soon, the matter escaped the boundaries of private review. Legal advisors became involved. Ecclesiastical courts, already examining moral concerns, now confronted financial irregularities that reinforced the growing portrait of disorder. In such proceedings, the wife held the advantage. Her dowry, often protected by contract, gave her standing to demand accountability. Misuse of assets is linked directly to violation of marital obligation. At this stage, the husband's authority over property could be restricted. Temporary freezing of assets, limitations on spending, or requirements for joint oversight shifted control away from him. These measures appeared administrative, but their symbolic impact was profound. A man once viewed as the steward of the estate now needed permission to exercise his own authority. In modern parallels, this resembles corporate executives being placed under financial supervision after irregularities surface. They retain the title but lose autonomy. The position remains, but power thins. Financial scrutiny also exposed the fragility of alliances. Families who had once offered support recalculated risk. A man drowning in debt became a liability rather than a partner. Prospective marriages for his children faltered. Political opportunities evaporated. Even those who sympathized with him hesitated to attach themselves to uncertainty. Meanwhile, the wife's strategic silence took on new force. Her documentation, letters preserved, accounts copied, and observations noted strengthened the case for oversight. She did not need to accuse loudly. The numbers did that for her. The mistress, though rarely the architect of financial collapse, became a symbol of misallocation. Her presence in the records transformed personal indulgence into measurable harm. Each coin spent on her became evidence against the husband's claim to responsible governance. Restrictions on property signaled consequences that no sword could deliver. An estate frozen was an estate in distress. A husband, stripped of financial discretion, was a husband perceived as incapable. Even before judgment formed, perception had already hardened. What is most haunting is the quietness of it all. No confrontation, no rebellion, no physical threat, merely ink on parchment, multiplied across pages, until the weight of evidence outweighed the weight of reputation. A household could crumble through financial pressure long before a legal verdict. A man could lose power not through force, but through arithmetic, and once numbers turned against him, even the greatest inheritance offered little defense. Audits replaced assumptions with measurable facts, tightening scrutiny page by page. Expenditures toward a mistress revealed fractures that figures could no longer conceal. When oversight restricted his control, the master of the estate learned that loss of power often begins not with conflict, but with calculation. Family involvement rarely arrived with noise. It entered through thresholds already weakened by rumor, hesitation, and unresolved disputes. The wife's relatives, especially her brothers, did not rush forward at the first hint of disorder. They watched, measured, and waited for confirmation that the household their sister married into could no longer shield her dignity. Once that certainty settled, intervention became not a choice but an obligation, one rooted in the Tudor belief that a woman's honour was inseparable from her family's standing. If she suffered humiliation, the shame radiated outward, touching every branch of her lineage. Her brothers often arrived under the guise of concern. They visited the estate, conversed politely with stewards, and lingered in the great hall long enough to observe the shifting atmosphere. Their questions appeared casual, yet each was shaped with deliberate purpose. They assessed whether the husband still held authority or whether hesitation crept behind his gestures. They noted the servants' glances, the silence in the corridors, the strained courtesy exchanged between spouses. A single visit could reveal more than a dozen letters. When brothers intervened, they brought with them a force the husband could not easily dismiss, reputation backed by lineage. A wife's family represented stability, inheritance, and alliances that extended into other estates and, at times, into the court itself. Their presence signaled that the matter had grown beyond a private quarrel. It had entered the realm of public responsibility, where male honor demanded visible action. The next step often involved correspondence, formal, measured, and precise. Letters were sent not out of emotion but out of legal foresight. These were documents written to withstand scrutiny, carefully worded to reflect concern without accusation, disappointment without insult. Each line pressed the husband into a narrower space, requesting clarification, demanding responsibility, and reminding him of obligations he had sworn to uphold. Such letters served a dual purpose. They warned the husband that his behavior was now under observation, and they established a written record. In an age when documentation carried more weight than testimony, this record formed a foundation for future proceedings. Whether the issue led to ecclesiastical court or civil arbitration, the wife's family ensured they possessed evidence of having acted properly, even patiently, before escalating further. For the husband, these letters felt like walls closing around him. He might respond with defensiveness, attempting to justify expenses, behavior, or decisions now under review. Yet each reply risked revealing more vulnerability. A poorly chosen phrase could imply guilt, a delayed response could imply evasion, and silence, once an option, became a liability. Meanwhile, the wife remained mostly still. Her role, shaped by expectation, did not require open accusation. Her family's actions spoke on her behalf, lending weight to grievances she never needed to articulate aloud. In this quiet unity, she found a form of protection, the shield of brothers who interpreted inaction as injury and hesitation as proof of mistreatment. Social pressure intensified quickly once the wife's family became visible actors. Neighbors whispered. Relatives on both sides calculated outcomes. Invitations shifted. Some extended with caution, others withdrawn entirely. The husband, once anchored by the stability of marriage, now faced a circle of scrutiny widening around him. Political allies hesitated. Friends reconsidered their proximity. The balance of public perception began to tilt. What made this intervention uniquely powerful was its combination of legitimacy and threat. Brothers did not need to raise weapons. Their presence alone implied that further escalation remained possible. In a society where violence between families had long historical precedent, even the hint of confrontation carried weight. But more often, the true battle unfolded through influence. Conversations with local clergy, polite inquiries to magistrates, and discreet exchanges among landholding families. Support for the husband eroded not through accusation, but through withdrawal. In many cases, the husband still held legal authority within his household. Yet socially, he began to diminish. A man under pressure from his wife's family appeared weakened, unable to maintain harmony or discipline. Rumors amplified this perception. His connection to a mistress, financial mismanagement, or moral failings became common topics in households far beyond his own. Each repetition stripped away a layer of public respect. The wife's family, in contrast, appeared composed and dutiful. Their intervention reflected responsibility, a willingness to protect their own. Their measured tone in letters and visits conveyed judgment without theatrics. They did not need to accuse loudly. Their restraint itself implied that matters were grave enough to demand seriousness. For the husband, there was little room to maneuver. To challenge the wife's family directly risked igniting a conflict he could not win. To ignore them signaled disrespect. To appease them required concessions he could not afford. In every direction, dignity eroded. By the time the matter reached official channels, whether church courts, local arbiters, or higher authorities, the groundwork had been laid with meticulous patience. The wife stood behind a well-organized network of relatives whose unity strengthened her position. The husband, isolated and defensive, faced proceedings already colored by perception. The slow tightening of social pressure became its own quiet verdict. Authority slipped from his grasp not through force, but through coordinated vigilance, and as each letter sealed his diminishing standing, he realized that a family's resolve could accomplish what no open feud ever needed to attempt. Relatives stepped forward with measured purpose, turning private disorder into a public obligation. Their letters shaped the boundaries of the conflict long before any judge intervened. Once the wife's family united behind her, the husband discovered that isolation, not accusation, was the weapon that cut deepest. The moment a man in Tudor society begins to lose control of his own story is never dramatic at first. It happens quietly, through gestures so small they almost escape notice. A delayed greeting. A polite conversation was cut short. A friend chooses a different seat at a feast with the kind of casual ease that conceals deliberate distance. These subtleties gather, forming a shadow that grows longer each day, until he begins to sense, slowly, uneasily, that he is no longer the center of the narrative he once commanded. His friends, once eager to share wine, news, and confident laughter, start to rearrange their routines. They enter rooms without looking directly at him, as if acknowledging him might align them with whatever whisper now follows. They speak with the careful tone of men, avoiding implication. It is not hostility that pushes them away, but preservation. In a world where reputation determined alliances, even a mild association with a man under suspicion risked entanglement. Friendship bowed before strategy. He sees it first during gatherings, the widening of space around him. No one announces it. No one explains. People simply adjust their bodies. Slight turns, hesitant steps, and conversations that form a circle just out of reach. He tries to step closer, to reclaim his place. Yet each attempt seems to dissolve before landing. Those around him behave as if they have not noticed his absence, though their movements betray that they have. The greetings in the great hall confirm what his instincts already suspect. Once, his entrance drew nods, warm acknowledgement, and inquiries about the estate, his horses, or recent travels. Now the responses are delayed, muted, wrapped in a politeness that conceals judgment. Some nod without lifting their eyes. Some speak as though reciting a ritual. Others pretend not to have seen him at all. The hall, with its stone walls and high beams, becomes a chamber of echoes, each greeting hollow, each silence louder than speech. He begins to understand that perception, not truth, governs the air around him. People do not wait for evidence. They wait for direction, and the shifting of social temperature tells them where safety lies. His wife's family has already moved into position. The audits have revealed concerning discrepancies. The mistress has become a symbol of division. His authority, once unquestioned, now trembles in the hands of those who decide how his story will be retold. The rumors spread faster than he can answer them. A servant murmurs something while pouring ale. A visiting relative overhears an accusation half-formed, but repeated as certainty. A neighbor claims to have seen something that confirms suspicion. Even those who do not believe the rumors repeat them, not out of malice, but because stories in Tudor England filled the void left by silence. Information became a form of currency, and the value of circulating it outweighed the risk of being incorrect. He attempts explanations, yet each one feels smaller than the whispers that erode him. Defending himself seems to amplify the very claims he wants to erase. His words, once sufficient to settle disputes or reassure allies, now lack weight. People listen but do not absorb. They nod but do not shift. Trust once broken, whether truly or by rumor, rarely returns in equal measure. Over time, he realizes that the narrative has drifted beyond his reach. Others are now telling it for him, wives in parlours, stewards in taverns, clerics in hushed discussions, noblemen during evening walks. Each retelling alters the shape of his reputation. He becomes less a man and more a cautionary tale, a subject of speculation, a symbol of failing authority. His identity fractures into versions he cannot correct. What unsettles him most is not the hostility but the indifference. No confrontation, no dramatic accusation, only a gradual thinning of support. People no longer seek his opinion. They no longer involve him in decisions. They no longer look to him as the anchor he once believed himself to be. His place remains physically unchanged, yet invisible lines of influence shift beneath him like sand. A man accustomed to command finds himself recast as an afterthought. His household, once loyal, watches him with measured eyes. His friends choose neutrality. Even his mistress grows cautious, sensing that proximity to him no longer offers advantage. He stands in the center of a room and feels the space forming around him, as if the world has silently agreed to move on without his permission. He attempts to reclaim the narrative by asserting his version of events, but the story has already developed its own momentum. Rumors do not wait for the truth. They travel through kitchens, markets, and corridors, carried by people who never intended harm but enjoy the sensation of possessing information others do not. Every whisper shortens the distance between speculation and certainty. Eventually, he stops trying to correct the narrative, not because he accepts defeat, but because he cannot locate the audience that still listens. Once a man loses the ears of his community, his voice becomes an echo. He keeps speaking, but the story no longer turns in his direction. A shift in greetings revealed more than cold courtesy. It announced that authority had begun to retreat. The silence of friends signaled that the narrative no longer belonged to him. And while he searched for a place to stand, rumor had already chosen where he would fall. The hall's chill told him the story was slipping away. Carried by whispers, he could not outrun. Each withdrawn glance marked another step toward isolation he could not reverse. By the time he recognized the distance forming around him, the tale of his downfall had already found its new authors. Servants in Tudor England lived in the quiet spaces where truth collected. They moved through corridors before dawn, extinguished candles long after the household slept, and heard conversations never meant for their ears. Their presence was constant yet overlooked, giving them a vantage point no nobleman could claim. A master might control land, wealth, and alliances, but he could never fully control the eyes and ears that served him. Servants learned the rhythms of a household the way sailors learned the sea, by instinct, repetition, and countless small observations. They could tell when a master returned later than usual, when tension thickened between husband and wife, when a letter arrived that altered the mood of the entire estate. They noticed missing coins, new dresses not accounted for, and meals prepared for guests who appeared without explanation. Patterns emerged where the master believed secrecy existed. Over time, they collected pieces of knowledge, the hidden door opening after midnight, the mistress's discreet visits, the shifting tone in a couple's arguments, The sudden generosity shown to one servant and not another. None of these details meant much alone, but together they formed a map of behaviour, one that could be reconstructed by anyone who cared enough to ask. When inquiries began, servants found themselves drawn into the dispute. Their testimonies became crucial not because they were dramatic, but because they provided consistency. A nobleman's defence might be eloquent, but servants offered something more dangerous: detail. They could recall dates, times, gestures, objects moved or forgotten, voices raised or hushed. Their recollections were shaped not by loyalty, but by memory. Memory sharpened by proximity. Some servants were persuaded to speak. Subtle promises, protection, money, improved positions, and encouraged cooperation. A wife's family, skilled in quiet strategy, often approached them indirectly. A sympathetic conversation in the kitchen, a kind word delivered at the right moment, assurance that truth served justice more than obedience did. These small influences guided servants toward testimony without ever appearing coercive. Others were pressured. A steward might demand honesty in the name of household order. A priest might invoke moral duty. Legal clerks might remind them of the consequences of withholding information. Fear, once introduced, worked efficiently. A servant who feared punishment for silence often chose disclosure, even if hesitantly, and some spoke simply because they had waited too long to be heard. Years of observing their master's temper, indulgence, or carelessness created resentment that surfaced when opportunity arrived. Their testimony, shaped by both truth and emotion, carried weight in ways the master never anticipated. The smallest statements could cause the greatest damage. A servant claiming to have seen the master hand money to a woman, not his wife, suggested misused funds. A maid who overheard arguments confirmed discord within the marriage. A stable hand noticing irregular travel patterns hinted at hidden meetings. None of these accounts alone proved guilt. Yet together they formed a narrative the courts could not ignore. Servants' testimonies also influenced public perception. Word spread quickly when a maid or footman was called to provide statements. People outside the estate understood that if servants were being questioned, something serious had occurred. Rumour seized on this knowledge, expanding it, shaping it, turning it into a story that travelled through markets and parlours far beyond the original estate. The husband often underestimated the influence of those beneath him. He viewed servants as background figures, necessary but irrelevant. Yet when proceedings began, he discovered that the individuals he overlooked now possessed the power to illuminate secrets he believed well hidden. Their familiarity with his private habits made them unexpected arbiters of truth. This power shift caused a subtle but profound reversal. The master, once unquestioned, found himself explaining actions described by people society deemed inferior. His authority weakened further as he attempted to dispute their accounts. The more he denied, the more credible their testimonies appeared. Servants, after all, had little to gain from lying. Nobles had everything to lose from exposure. The household dynamic changed rapidly. Servants moved with caution, aware that every gesture might be interpreted as allegiance to one side or the other. Some withdrew, performing duties with mechanical obedience. Others positioned themselves quietly behind the wife, sensing that her cause held stability while the master's position eroded. The wife, though often silent, understood the value of their testimonies. She did not command them openly. She simply allowed truth to reach her through natural channels. The murmurs of maids, the hesitations of stewards, the way certain servants lingered when she entered a room as if offering unspoken support. She recognized in their quiet presence a shift in loyalty that strengthened her without requiring words. What made servant testimony so powerful was its authenticity. They witnessed life not as nobles wished it to appear, but as it was lived. Unguarded, flawed, and vulnerable. Their words, shaped by routine rather than performance, painted a portrait no legal defense could fully erase. A household began to tilt when servants stepped forward with their accounts. A man's authority weakened when those he overlooked became the ones who described him. And as each quiet testimony found its place, the truth he feared most grew impossible to contain. Those who swept his floors remembered more than he imagined, revealing the habits he thought invisible. Their words gathered weight, turning ordinary observations into a structure of proof. By the time he recognized their power, the narrative had already shifted beyond his reach. Public opinion in Tudor England did not move like a tide. It moved like smoke, thin, shifting, impossible to grasp, yet capable of filling every room before anyone noticed. Once suspicion entered the air, it drifted through corridors, markets, and great halls, with a patience that felt almost deliberate. A man under scrutiny discovered that the true battleground was not court or clergy, but the invisible realm where whispers became certainties long before he was granted a chance to speak. Anonymous letters played a central role in shaping this realm. They arrived, folded tightly, sealed without signature, carrying words chosen to wound with precision. Some were left on benches in chapels. Others slipped beneath doors or were handed discreetly to stewards who pretended not to read them. The authors never identified themselves. In Tudor society, accusation without a name carried its own kind of power. It suggested that wrongdoing was so obvious that even strangers felt compelled to speak. These letters rarely contained outright lies. Instead, they stitched together fragments of truth: a late-night ride, a missing sum of money, a woman seen leaving a side entrance of the estate. Each detail alone was harmless, but when arranged carefully, they implied a pattern of misconduct that the public found irresistible. People repeated the letters' contents not because they believed them fully, but because the letters provided shape to suspicions already circulating. Social events became stages where these whispers turned into quiet judgment. Feasts, weddings, and court gatherings once served as opportunities for alliances. Now they transformed into arenas where reputation was weighed with unspoken calculations. A man under suspicion felt the shift immediately. Conversations paused as he approached. Groups closed their circles subtly, leaving him on the outside. Women exchanged glances heavy with interpretation. Men spoke to him with courtesy, but without warmth, as though they feared guilt might travel through proximity. Even those who maintained friendliness did so with a caution that betrayed uncertainty. They asked polite questions but left before the answers finished. Their smiles were thin, their gestures restrained. They did not want to offend him, yet they also did not want to be associated with a man whose story had become unstable. Social survival required distance. The court itself, always attentive to rumour, responded with its own muted choreography. Political figures observed, exchanging low conversations in alcoves or behind tapestries. They watched not only the man at the centre of the whispers, but the people around him who still supported him, who stepped back, who shifted their alignment. To survive in court politics meant recognizing when a falling reputation might drag others down with it. As rumours grew, his political standing began to tremble. Authority in Tudor England was not simply a matter of position, it depended on the confidence others placed in his reliability. A man suspected of moral or financial disorder was seen as unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened alliances. Promises he once relied on now wavered. Opportunities that seemed assured began to dissolve without explanation. Letters he wrote to allies received delayed or lukewarm replies. Officials avoided meeting him in public, choosing instead to send short notes expressing regret for their absence. What unsettled him most was not the hostility but the uncertainty. Rumours possessed no clear origin, no path he could trace, no accuser he could confront. They rose from the collective mind of the court, shaping themselves according to the anxieties and ambitions of those who repeated them. He tried to silence them with reason, but reason faltered before fear, envy, and fascination. People preferred stories that confirmed their expectations about failing men, and his life now resembled a tale too compelling to ignore. The wife's family, though discreet, understood how to use public perception to their advantage. They did not speak openly, but their quiet presence at gatherings reinforced the impression that concern had become justified. Their restraint suggested dignity. Their silence implied injury, and silence, in matters of scandal, often spoke louder than accusation. The mistress, once a symbol of indulgence, now became a symbol of evidence. Her presence in the narrative made it easier for people to believe the worst. Even those who sympathized with her contributed to the widening focus of the scandal, discussing her plight or misfortune in ways that kept the husband's indiscretions firmly in the public conscience. Meanwhile, anonymous letters continued to circulate. Some were genuine warnings, others were embellishments. A few were inventions crafted by those hoping to shape the outcome for personal gain. Yet all of them pushed the story further from the husband's control. Perception hardened into conclusion long before he had the chance to defend himself. He felt the pressure in every interaction. The lingering pause before someone greeted him. The glance exchanged between two nobles as he passed. The sudden quiet that followed his footsteps. His identity fractured, reshaped not by truth, but by the collective will of the court. Reputation in Tudor England did not fall like a stone. It unravelled like a thread. A whisper became an account became a belief, and a belief became judgment. By the time he sensed the weight of public opinion, it had already settled heavily upon him. Anonymous notes drifted through the court like sparks, igniting stories no one dared claim. Each gathering revealed how judgment settled in the spaces words avoided. And as his political footing thinned, he realized that influence could vanish quietly. Long before anyone admitted it aloud, intervention from the highest levels of Tudor authority did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with measured silence, with gestures so controlled that their meaning felt heavier than open reprimand. When a scandal touched a nobleman of significant rank, it ceased to be a private misfortune and became a matter that brushed against the stability of the realm itself. The king and his closest officers watched such situations with a disciplined eye, assessing not simply guilt or innocence, but the potential consequences for alliances, loyalty, and political balance. A nobleman drawn into controversy became a risk. His estate, his connections, his influence at court, these were no longer assets, but variables that could destabilize delicate arrangements. The king understood this instinctively. Power, after all, was not maintained by force alone, but by the careful orchestration of favor. When a man's household faltered, his ability to contribute to the crown weakened. A compromised nobleman could not serve effectively in council, command troops with confidence, or negotiate alliances without casting shadows of uncertainty. The earliest sign of royal concern appeared in subtle withdrawal. The king might stop requesting the nobleman's presence for counsel. Letters once addressed warmly shifted into cooler, more formal language. Invitations to feasts or hunts ceased without explanation. These gestures were not punishment, they were distance. Distance designed to protect the crown from association with disorder. The man under scrutiny felt the shift immediately. His absence from these spaces became a message louder than any spoken reprimand. Senior officials followed the king's lead. Courtiers observed which direction the authority leaned and adjusted their behavior accordingly. A nobleman who once commanded attention found conversations drifting away from him, replaced by polite gestures that concealed caution. Even those who once relied on him began to reassess whether their association might draw unwanted scrutiny. Political survival required adaptation, and distancing oneself from a man under suspicion became a quiet but essential strategy. When allegations touched matters of morality or financial mismanagement, intervention could intensify. The king, whose image required the projection of order and virtue, could not afford to appear tolerant of instability among his nobles. The withdrawal of royal favour then became unmistakable. Grants delayed, requests unanswered. Patronage was redirected to men whose reputations remained untarnished. Nothing overt, yet everything decisive. For those serving in official positions, the consequences grew sharper. A man entrusted with duties at court, governance, diplomacy, and estate management might find his responsibilities reassigned. No accusation was issued, no sentence declared, yet the meaning was impossible to misinterpret. A replacement often arrived framed as a necessity, a temporary appointment, a redistribution of workload, a strategic reassignment. Everyone understood these as polite disguises for displacement. This process exposed the fragility of status in Tudor England. A nobleman's authority did not reside solely in his bloodline or landholdings. It depended on continuous affirmation from the sovereign. Without that affirmation, titles felt hollow. Influence thinned. Doors closed. A man who once stepped confidently into council chambers now lingered at the threshold, aware that his presence no longer carried expectation but discomfort. The king rarely spoke directly about such declines. Silence served him better. To name a man's fall was to commit the crown to an explicit stance, but to withdraw quietly left room for manoeuvre. If the scandal was resolved favourably, the nobleman could be restored without embarrassment. If it worsened, the king could claim prudence for having distanced himself early. This ambiguity preserved royal authority while allowing court society to interpret the situation according to its own unspoken logic. For the nobleman, however, ambiguity became torment. He recognized that the king's absence from his affairs signaled far more than mere oversight. It signaled a reckoning that approached without hurry, without explanation, without a single opportunity for rebuttal. Influence had slipped from him, not through confrontation, but through omission. In Tudor England, few punishments were as effective as being forgotten. Favour could elevate a man within a day. Its withdrawal could hollow him just as quickly. And behind every quiet reassignment stood the unmistakable truth that the king no longer saw him as indispensable. Royal silence replaced formal warmth, marking the first fracture in his standing. Each withdrawn gesture signalled that power had begun to drift away from him. By the time a new face filled the role he once held, he understood that loss arrived not with outrage, but with calm precision. Loss in Tudor England did not always arrive with violence. More often, it came through a gradual unthreading, a quiet dissolution of privileges, possessions, and influence that once seemed immovable. A man could continue walking the same halls, sitting at the same table, wearing the same clothes, yet find that none of these things truly belonged to him anymore. His world shifted not through force, but through an administrative elegance that left no wounds visible and no room for protest. Property was usually the first element to change shape. Legal oversight, once imposed, placed his estate into a state of supervised fragility. Documents were reviewed, ledgers disentangled, and ownership questioned line by line. Transfers occurred slowly, justified as temporary measures to protect assets or preserve inheritance. Yet their meaning was unmistakable. Land that had carried his family's name for generations began sliding out of his grasp through signatures penned by others. Parcels were reassigned to trustees, rents redirected, and authority redistributed. The estate remained physically unchanged, but its centre of control moved elsewhere. These transfers rarely involved confrontation. Instead, they unfolded through careful procedures that left the man with little ground to challenge. Advisors cited legal necessity. Clerics invoked moral obligation. Relatives framed decisions as protective rather than punitive. He might stand in the middle of his own property and still feel like a guest. Present, but irrelevant to its governance. His title persisted, but his power within the land that title represented thinned, thread by thread. The erosion of authority mirrored this quiet transformation. His voice at council meetings was not silenced. It simply stopped carrying weight. People listened, but only in the polite, distant manner, reserved for those whose opinions no longer shaped decisions. Invitations to discussions grew rare. Correspondence shifted into a passive tone. Men who once sought his approval now made choices without consulting him. Influence, like property, did not vanish at once. It receded until he began to sense that decisions were being made in rooms he no longer belonged in. The transition felt less like a fall and more like a fading. No one declared him unfit. No one challenged him directly. Yet every withdrawn gesture, every missing invitation, every polite avoidance contributed to a growing understanding. The sphere he once governed now operated without him. Power, in Tudor society, relied heavily on perception, and once perception shifted, authority became little more than a borrowed garment that others could easily remove. Even his position within the court, once secured by loyalty and service, grew tenuous. Posts that he believed permanent were quietly reassigned. Duties he once performed with certainty were delegated to younger, more reliable figures. The official explanation was always gentle. A restructuring, a redistribution, a necessary adjustment. But beneath these words lay the truth he could no longer deny. He was being replaced without being dismissed. What made this process particularly cruel was its subtlety. There was no dramatic sentence handed down, no exile, no formal condemnation. He remained free, alive, and physically situated among the same people, but spiritually and politically displaced. Society treated him as though he were fading from relevance, and he found himself mourning privileges that decayed without ceremony. A man accustomed to defending himself against direct threats now faced an enemy without shape. He could not confront whispers. He could not challenge administrative adjustments. He could not stop signatures written by hands, authorized by law or family. He could only watch as each decision, justified by reason or morality, chipped away at the world he once commanded. He noticed the shift most clearly when walking through his estate. Servants paused with uncertainty. Managers spoke with formality instead of deference. Even the rhythm of the household felt altered, as though the place had already begun adjusting to life without his direction. The familiarity of the landscape became a reminder of what he no longer controlled. Yet the process continued with gentle persistence. No blood spilled, no violence erupted, but everything that defined his place in society, land, authority, and position, slipped through legal mechanisms designed not to punish, but to correct. Correction, however, could be more devastating than punishment. His downfall did not echo through the kingdom. It whispered through paperwork. His identity was not destroyed by force, but diluted through careful reassignments. And as each asset, each responsibility, each privilege drifted away, he learned that a life could be dismantled without a single sword being drawn. Property changed hands while he still walked its fields, revealing how control could vanish without confrontation. Authority thinned quietly, leaving him present in the room but absent from its decisions. When he finally sensed the full extent of the shift, he understood that a man could lose everything while remaining perfectly alive. Separation in Tudor England unfolded not through sudden rupture, but through a slow, deliberate unbinding of vows that once tied two households together. A marriage did not dissolve simply because affection eroded. It dissolved when the moral, legal, and social frameworks surrounding it could no longer bear the strain of scandal. For a man already weakened by rumors, shifting alliances, and declining authority, the prospect of annulment or enforced separation became a final reckoning, one that exposed the fragile scaffolding beneath his public life. A request for annulment on moral grounds was never made lightly. It required a pattern of behavior serious enough to argue that the marriage had been compromised at its foundation. The wife, though silent in public, had standing through her dowry, her family's support, and the moral expectations placed upon her. Religious courts examined the matter with painstaking detail, passing through testimonies, financial ledgers, letters, and the accounts of servants who had seen more than they were ever meant to witness. The husband found himself confronting not just accusations, but interpretations of his life rendered by others. Interpretations he could neither control nor predict. Moral failing carried weight in these courts. Infidelity implied not only personal betrayal but spiritual breach. Financial mismanagement suggested neglect of marital duty. Emotional cruelty or domestic violence, once revealed, shifted the case decisively. Each allegation added another stone to the growing structure of justification for separation. The husband, who once believed the marital bond immune to external review, now watched it dissected with clinical precision. Yet even the moral dimension paled beside the question of children. Custody disputes in Tudor society were battles fought in the language of legacy. Sons represented inheritance, lineage, and the continuation of a family's influence. Daughters tied households together through future marriages. A man whose reputation had deteriorated risked losing not only authority over his estate, but also authority over his offspring. Courts tended to favor stability, and a household under the wife's family's protection appeared safer than one steered by a man overshadowed by scandal. This shift in custody was more than emotional loss. It was political diminishment. Children were symbols of continuity, and without them, his place within the extended web of alliances weakened further. Decisions regarding their education, their guardianship, and their inheritance would proceed without his hand. The realization that he might be excluded from shaping their future struck deeper than any legal ruling. Then came the matter of property division, an ordeal that intensified every fracture already present. The estate, once unified under his authority, was now dissected piece by piece. Lawyers scrutinized dowries, inheritances, joint holdings, and debts. The wife's family insisted upon financial restitution, citing mismanagement, neglect, or misuse of marital assets. Land that he considered extensions of his identity became bargaining tools. Money, he believed secure, dissolved into obligations. Negotiations rarely favored him. A man under suspicion lacked the leverage to argue effectively. His financial missteps, once dismissed as private indulgence, were now aligned with moral failure and marital breach. Every coin he had spent unwisely returned to accuse him. Every detail recorded by clerks and stewards strengthened the case against him. Even allies hesitated to intervene, unwilling to risk their reputations for a man whose fall seemed inevitable. Separation did not merely remove a wife from a husband, it removed a structure of stability from a man already unbalanced. He lost not only companionship, but legitimacy. A separated nobleman appeared diminished, unable to retain control over his household. An annulled marriage suggested deeper flaws. Moral, spiritual, or practical, that society quietly attributed to him, regardless of the court's reasoning. He still lived, still walked familiar halls, still bore his title. Yet every decision, every loss, every ruling made him feel further from the life he once believed unshakable. He saw his children less. His estate shrank. His wife's family replaced his presence with their authority. The corridors grew colder, not through temperature, but through absence. What made it most devastating was the awareness that this dissolution was not forced upon him suddenly. It unfolded through formalities, paperwork, testimonies, and signatures. No blade, no rebellion, no outward conflict. Only the slow turning of legal machinery that extracted him piece by piece from the world he had known. A marriage, once treated as indestructible, became fragile under scrutiny. A father's claim weakened when his reputation could no longer shield his children. And as property slipped into other hands, he understood that separation could wound more deeply than exile. Moral arguments dismantled the union that once protected him. Custody decisions reshaped the family he believed was immovable. As the estate itself fractured, he realized that losing a marriage meant losing the entire structure built around it. Isolation in Tudor England rarely arrived with thunder. It descended gradually, like a cool mist that blurred familiar outlines, until a man no longer recognized the world he once navigated with ease. For someone already weakened by scandal, legal pressure, and the steady erosion of authority, social withdrawal became the quiet confirmation that his place in society had begun to collapse. People did not confront him. They simply rearranged their lives so that he no longer fit inside them. The first signs appeared in the form of absence. Invitations that once arrived with predictable regularity ceased without explanation. Feasts, hunts, weddings, baptisms, and events he once considered routine markers of noble life continued without his presence. He learned of them only after they occurred. Overhearing servants mention the music played or the guests who attended. No explicit exclusion was needed. Silence accomplished the task more effectively. He attempted to dismiss these omissions as oversight, clerical error, or unfortunate timing. Yet, as the pattern repeated, denial gave way to recognition. Each missing invitation signaled not only social retreat, but political assessment. Attendance required association, and no one wished to be associated with a man whose reputation trembled under public scrutiny. Hosts protected themselves by erasing him from their lists before he became a liability. Political allies followed suit with subtle precision. They did not sever ties openly. They redefined them. Letters addressing shared plans arrived less frequently and with diminished warmth. Promises once made in confidence shifted into vague statements or conditional support. Meetings were postponed, then quietly abandoned. A man who had relied on strategic partnerships found himself navigating a landscape where trust had thinned into polite distance. These allies acted out of necessity rather than malice. Tudor politics demanded constant recalibration. Aligning with a weakened nobleman threatened to stain their reputations, jeopardize their standing, and invite scrutiny from the court. They stepped away not because they disagreed with him, but because survival required it. Their withdrawal carved out empty spaces where influence once lived. Even more painful was the shift from his wife's family. Their involvement had been decisive in earlier stages of the conflict, but now their distance became equally significant. Publicly, they behaved with correctness. Polite greetings, formal gestures, and expressions of concern that concealed nothing. Privately, their separation spoke clearly. They did not visit his estate. They did not inquire about his affairs beyond what legal obligations demanded. They appeared at court without acknowledging him beyond courtesy. In Tudor society, family support served as a crucial anchor. Its withdrawal suggested not only judgment, but finality. The wife's family no longer needed to intervene. The legal and social mechanisms they set in motion had already begun to reshape the household. Their distance signaled to the wider community that his position had become untenable. Isolation reshaped even the physical spaces he inhabited. The great hall felt larger when fewer people greeted him. Corridors echoed with a quiet that once would have seemed peaceful, but now felt accusatory. Servants performed duties with a neutrality that bordered on detachment, careful not to display allegiance to a man whose influence waned. Those who once lingered to exchange brief conversations now finished tasks quickly before slipping away. He felt the absence of conversation most acutely, where once he stepped into a room and sparked dialogue. Now, He walked through spaces that continued without acknowledging his presence. People lowered their voices when he approached, then resumed speaking only after he passed. His footsteps sounded louder than before, not because the hall had changed, but because no other sound rose to meet them. The psychological weight of isolation pressed heavily. A man accustomed to being seen, I heard, and deferred to now encountered a world that moved around him rather than with him. He was not shunned outright. Such an act would have required courage. But he was managed, positioned, circumvented, slowly escorted to the margins of social and political life without a single door closed in his face. Yet without any left open either. What made this isolation particularly devastating was its efficiency. No accusation was required. No formal decree issued. The community simply adjusted itself, like water flowing around a stone, until he realized he no longer shaped the current. His presence stirred no reaction, caused no disruption, elicited no interest. He was not an enemy. He was irrelevant. Each vanished invitation revealed how swiftly society distanced itself from uncertainty. Each retreating ally demonstrated that loyalty, in Tudor England, bowed before preservation. And the wife's family, by maintaining public distance, confirmed that isolation had become his new inheritance. Rooms once familiar lost their warmth as people drifted away with unspoken judgment. Political partners stepped back, choosing safety over association. When the wife's family kept their distance with deliberate calm, he understood that isolation could hollow a life more completely than any public sentence. Long-term consequences in Tudor England rarely announced themselves with immediacy. They accumulated in slow, deliberate increments until a man discovered that the economic foundation beneath him had thinned beyond repair. Scandal, once rooted in rumour and domestic discord, eventually reached the ledgers, the lands, and the inheritance lines that defined a nobleman's identity. And when financial decline began, it did not merely burden him, it reshaped the future of his entire household. The first blow often came in the form of enforced repayment. What had once been private debt, favours owed, loans taken quietly, obligations postponed, became a matter of public scrutiny once legal proceedings exposed his mismanagement. Creditors, emboldened by the weakening of his reputation, pressed their claims with new urgency. Those who once granted leniency now demanded resolution. They understood that a falling nobleman might soon lose the means to repay them, and so they targeted him precisely at the moment he had the least leverage. Compensation became another unavoidable burden. Courts or negotiated settlements required him to provide financial restitution to his wife's family for misuse of marital assets or moral breach. Such payments rarely reflected the actual sums in question. Instead, they symbolized punishment cloaked in legal formality. What he had spent in secret was now extracted publicly, further diminishing the wealth he once considered secure. As debts accumulated, land, his most valuable and symbolic asset, became vulnerable. Estates served as both economic engines and markers of lineage. To mortgage them was to admit weakness. Yet he found himself with little choice. Land was the only resource substantial enough to satisfy creditors, appease legal demands, or maintain the minimal dignity expected of a noble household. Piece by piece, parcels of property were pledged as collateral. Their ownership tied to contracts he barely had the strength to negotiate. Mortgaging land did not simply reduce his wealth, it altered the perception of his legacy. Neighbours noticed fields no longer under his direct control. Tenants whispered about new overseers. Relatives exchanged cautious looks, aware that once an estate entered the cycle of debt, recovery became almost impossible. Even if the land technically remained his, the authority it represented dissolved the moment it secured someone else's financial claim. This erosion extended outward, touching the next generation with quiet precision. A son in Tudor society depended on land for status, opportunity, and inheritance, land determined marriage prospects, political alliances, and the ability to maintain noble rank. As the estate fractured, so did the son's future. What had once been a clear path, inherit the land, marry advantageously, strengthen the family line, became a narrower, more uncertain passage. Families evaluating potential marriage alliances reconsidered. Few wished to join themselves to a house weighed down by debt or tainted by scandal. A son, who should have been a desirable match, found himself bypassed in favor of young men whose households remained stable. Even promising negotiations dissolved quietly when whispers of financial instability spread. The son was judged not by his own conduct, but by the decline shadowing his father. Inheritance itself became precarious. Lands tied to mortgages might not survive long enough to be passed down. Funds intended for dowries or family expansion were consumed by repayments. The legal turmoil surrounding annulment or separation could redefine inheritance structures, granting larger shares to the wife's family or placing certain holdings under external supervision. The son, once assured of continuity, inherited complication instead. For the father, this loss cut more deeply than the depletion of his own wealth. Watching his child's prospects dim was a reminder that his failure had radiated beyond himself. Tudor society held men responsible for the futures they constructed for their heirs. A damaged inheritance signalled more than financial ruin. It signalled a fracture in lineage, a disruption in the long chain connecting past and future generations. Even after the legal proceedings concluded and the scandal faded from public discussion, the financial consequences persisted. Debt had its own memory. Mortgages had their own pace. Obligations continued to shape his days long after social interest drifted elsewhere. He found himself trapped in a life that felt smaller, slower, and heavier, shaped not by opportunities but by limitations he could never fully escape. Economic decline did not require violence or exile to devastate a man's identity. Debt hollowed him out from within, replacing confidence with calculation, and each loss, money, land, inheritance, reminded him that ruin could unfold quietly. With no one raising a weapon, repayments drained the wealth he once believed unshakable. Mortgaged land revealed how quickly his legacy could erode. As his son's prospects dimmed, he understood that financial ruin could outlast scandal itself. Honour in Tudor England did not vanish with spectacle. It dissolved gradually, thinning like old parchment exposed to damp air, losing strength long before anyone acknowledged its decay. A man could still stand, speak, and perform the motions of his former life, yet feel something collapsing quietly beneath the surface. A slow internal rot that left no visible wound, but hollowed him just the same. The world around him continued with its rituals, unaware or unwilling to admit how much of his identity had already slipped beyond recovery. There were no outbursts, no public condemnations, no dramatic punishments. Instead, the decline unfolded in silence. That silence, once a refuge, became a weight pressing against him from all sides. He entered rooms where conversations softened upon his arrival, not from respect, but from unease. No accusation was spoken aloud. Yet every restrained gesture marked another layer of truth he could not escape. In the absence of sound, suspicion sharpened. The lack of triumph from others was equally disquieting. No rivals celebrated his fall. No crowds gathered to witness punishment. Indifference proved more devastating than hostility. People simply continued their lives, adjusting instinctively to his reduced presence. They did not offer comfort, but neither did they show cruelty. They treated him as though he had already drifted into a separate world, one that shadowed the edges of their own without ever crossing fully back into it. His decline felt most pronounced during public gatherings, whether in the parish church, the Great Hall, or the marketplace. The space around him shifted. People stepped aside, not out of fear, but from instinct, as though clearing a path for something fragile rather than someone powerful. They spoke to him with gentle neutrality, offering no hint of malice, yet no recognition of former authority. Even the clergy, once deferential, now addressed him with measured distance, careful not to imply a closeness the community no longer acknowledged. Punishment in Tudor society often manifested through absence. No sentence was proclaimed. Instead, opportunities simply failed to appear. He received no summons to advise on disputes. No invitations to feasts reached his household. No letters arrived requesting his counsel. Days, once filled with responsibility and expectation, flattened into quiet routines. He found himself with time he no longer wished to possess, pacing through the remnants of a life that continued without him. The physical surroundings remained unchanged, but their meaning altered. The hearth, once a symbol of domestic stability, now radiated a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The great table where he once presided over meals felt too large, its length a reminder of the company he no longer attracted. Even the windows seemed to observe him differently, framing a world that had moved beyond his grasp. He listened for sounds that marked his role in the household, footsteps approaching, servants seeking instruction, visitors arriving with matters requiring his judgment. Instead, he heard the muted rhythm of daily life proceeding without interruption. Decisions were being made, conversations were occurring, and tasks were underway, but none required his involvement. He had not been exiled, yet he no longer belonged at the center of anything. In that silence, he confronted the truth that honor did not fall swiftly. It decayed by degrees, losing vitality until what remained was only the memory of its former weight. People did not speak of him with contempt. They spoke of him less and less. His name receded from discussion, replaced by new figures whose reputations remained intact. Oblivion, not infamy, became the shape of his decline. The absence of formal judgment left him suspended. Without a verdict, he had nothing to refute. Without punishment, he had nothing to overcome. He lived in a state of unfinished consequence, where each day mirrored the last, yet felt subtly diminished. The silence surrounding him was not peace, it was erosion. This erosion spread to those closest to him. Servants behaved with careful restraint, as though unsure how to navigate the fragile landscape his presence created. His children grew distant, sensing shifts they could not yet articulate. Even his relatives avoided discussing the matter, offering polite conversation that skirted the edges of truth. The silence felt shared yet unacknowledged, a collective decision to let decay proceed without interference. He discovered that dignity survived not in proclamation, but in endurance. He walked through his estate with steady steps, aware that each movement felt heavier than before. He greeted people with a measured tone, knowing his words no longer shaped their perception. He maintained rituals that once expressed authority, but now served only to mark the passage of time. Honor, he realized, did not end with dramatic collapse. It thinned, unraveled, and softened into something unrecognizable. And in the quiet that surrounded him, he confronted the truth that silence could destroy more completely than any public sentence. No cheers marked the moment his standing began to fade. No executioner declared the end of his influence. Through a long, unbroken quiet, he learned that a man's honor could wither without anyone raising their voice. The fall of a mistress in Tudor England unfolded in shadows, not in fire. Once her presence stirred whispers of influence, curiosity, or envy. But scandal transformed her into something fragile, an unwelcome reminder of a story no one wished to repeat aloud. Her fate drifted without direction, shaped not by her own decisions, but by the legal machinery. Family pressures, and social recalculations that determined her new place. And in a world where reputation defined survival, she discovered that notoriety lingered long after affection dissolved. Removal from the household often marked the beginning of her decline. It came quietly, without confrontation, delivered through a steward's measured instructions or a relative's concerned intervention. Rooms she once entered freely became inaccessible. Servants, once deferential, avoided her with uneasy glances. She was escorted away not with anger, but with efficiency, as though the household sought to erase her presence with as little disruption as possible. Her belongings were gathered quickly, often without her input, and within hours, she found herself outside the walls that had once sheltered her secret importance. Such removal served multiple purposes. It appeased the wife's family. It protected the husband's remaining dignity. It signaled to the community that the scandal had reached a point of correction. And above all, it prevented her from influencing testimony, accessing documents, or being seen as a lingering temptation. Her departure soothed anxieties, even as it deepened her own sense of displacement. Pressure to marry another man soon followed. This marriage was not an opportunity, but a containment strategy, a way to redirect her life far from the realm where she had once disrupted order. Families, clergy, or legal intermediaries arranged these unions with cold practicality. A minor gentleman, a widower of modest standing, or a distant cousin in need of alliance became the chosen candidate. The match required no affection, only convenience. Marriage would place her under another man's authority, reducing the risk that she might reappear, claim favours, or challenge the narrative being constructed around her. The mistress understood this clearly. She was not being offered a fresh beginning, but being manoeuvred into obscurity. A new marriage bound her to a household that expected gratitude rather than ambition. She sensed the unspoken message. Her past must remain buried. Her future must remain small. Even those arranging the marriage rarely spoke to her directly. Decisions were made around her rather than with her, reinforcing that she had become a problem to be managed, not a person to be consulted. Yet the most haunting transformation occurred not in her circumstances, but in the documents that recorded them. Legal proceedings reshaped her into a figure of abstraction. A note in a ledger, a name in testimony, a point of reference in disputes about property or betrayal. She became part of the written record, but only as evidence, never as a voice. Lawyers described her actions with clinical detachment. Judges referenced her as an object of consequence, a catalyst rather than a character. Even servants, when questioned, spoke of her as though she existed only in glimpses and implications. This transformation into a legal shadow drained her identity. What she felt, feared, or remembered had no place in proceedings designed to determine responsibility and restructure households. She watched pieces of her life translated into statements she barely recognized. In these documents, she was neither victim nor villain, only a marker indicating where blame shifted. Once the case concluded, her legal presence lingered long after her physical absence. Records preserved her name in contexts that ensured no household would welcome her easily. Future acquaintances who learned of her past regarded her cautiously, unsure whether she represented danger or misfortune. Her existence became a quiet warning whispered between families. Proximity to scandal left traces that could not be washed away. Even the man whose affection once elevated her did not defend her. His survival required distance. If she suffered under the weight of his downfall, that suffering became collateral, unacknowledged, unaddressed. Their connection, once private and consuming, dissolved into a narrative he could no longer afford to revisit. She adapted to obscurity because no alternative remained. Days blurred into routines stripped of meaning. Conversations grew sparse. She avoided gatherings where recognition might provoke discomfort. In time, People forgot the details of her involvement. But they remembered the outline. A woman linked to ruin. The specifics no longer mattered. The stain did. Her fate revealed the asymmetry of scandal. He lost power. She lost the life she had built around him entirely. He endured judgment. She endured erasure. Removal from the household silenced her before she could defend herself. A forced marriage redirected her life into quiet containment. Through legal documents that reduced her to evidence, she understood that scandal could outlive affection, leaving her as little more than a shadow no one wished to acknowledge. Power in Tudor England was often described as a structure of stone, solid, immovable, shaped by lineage and law. Yet scandal revealed how fragile that structure truly was, exposing cracks that ran through gender expectations, legal authority, and the illusion of male invulnerability. A man might believe himself protected by his title, his estate, and his place in society. But the moment these collided with moral scrutiny, the balance shifted. What appeared permanent could crumble through quiet forces he never anticipated. Law served as one of those forces, designed to preserve order. It could also be wielded as a weapon. Men who once invoked the law to defend their rights found themselves ensnared by the same system when their conduct invited examination. Legal procedures did not shout. They whispered through paperwork, hearings, and testimonies that accumulated like sediment. Each clause, each recorded statement, reshaped the boundaries of power. A nobleman discovered that his authority ended the moment the law defined him as a source of disorder rather than stability. Women, though constrained by custom, understood this dynamic. A wife did not need to raise her voice to challenge her husband. She needed only to document, to observe, to gather the quiet evidence that aligned legal mechanisms against him. Her silence became a strategy. Her patience became leverage. And once the law recognized her claims, her influence surpassed the husband's in ways society did not openly acknowledge. In these moments, power shifted not through defiance but through mastery of the system. Men believed they controlled. Scandal itself possessed more weight than physical force. A sword could wound a man's body, but scandal wounded his standing. Something far more difficult to mend. Even the threat of violence paled before the spread of rumor. Whispers traveled where soldiers could not. They altered alliances, shaped public opinion, and eroded trust without ever raising a blade. A man who survived battle might still be undone by the murmurs that followed him into the great hall. This imbalance emerged most clearly when scandal intersected with gender. Society expected men to embody control, judgment, and moral leadership. Once these expectations fractured, his decline accelerated. People judged men more harshly when they stumbled, not because their flaws were greater, but because their roles demanded near perfection. A single misstep confirmed fears that authority had been misplaced. And in a culture that prized stability, misplaced authority was treated as contagion. Women, by contrast, navigated a more flexible landscape. They were judged. Certainly, prejudice was real and merciless. Yet because they were presumed to inhabit the periphery of power, their involvement in scandal did not threaten the realm's structure as directly. Their actions were interpreted through personal morality, not political identity. Men risked collapse because their failures symbolized disorder in the larger social fabric. Women risked marginalization, but men risked disintegration. This disparity allowed women unexpected influence. A wife could redirect the legal machinery with precision, using her prescribed role as moral guardian to expose her husband's inconsistencies. A mistress, despite her vulnerability, could become the catalyst that revealed fissures in a man's authority. Even servants, standing outside gendered power structures, could shift outcomes through testimony that carried the weight of proximity. Male invincibility proved an illusion. A husband relied on the assumption that his gender guaranteed protection. but a scandal demonstrated otherwise. The law could strip him of property. Witnesses could strip him of privacy. Rumour could strip him of his reputation. And once reputation fell, gender offered no shield. Masculinity did not prevent isolation. It heightened the shame of it. Honour demanded resilience. Yet the forces aligned against him demanded surrender. This collapse did not announce itself with violence. It unfolded in the space between perception and reality. A man remained physically untouched. Yet everything that defined him, authority, stability, and influence, dissolved with quiet efficiency. He walked through his estate with the same posture he had always carried. Yet the rooms felt larger, emptier, harder to command. The world had not changed shape, but his place within it had. In the end, power proved more fluid than tradition admitted. The law did not protect those who misused it. Scandal struck deeper than any blade, and a man who believed himself unassailable learned that his downfall required no force, only the steady turning of social and legal tides. Legal mechanisms cut through privilege with the precision of a practiced hand. Rumour and reputation reshaped authority more effectively than violence. In witnessing one man's unraveling, it became clear that male power in Tudor England was never as absolute as it claimed to be. A signature carried more weight than any echo of whispered judgment. Ink on parchment redirected inheritance, alliance, and survival itself. And as the seal dried, a man learned how quietly the foundation of an entire lineage could fall away. He once believed that ruin required spectacle, armed men forcing open doors, accusations shouted before an audience, a formal sentence echoing across a great hall. Yet nothing so dramatic was necessary to unmake what he had built. The end approached without sound. No clash of steel, no raised voices. Only clerks moving steadily, witnesses speaking with controlled clarity, and a judge whose neutrality felt colder than condemnation. The world did not crumble. It shifted carefully, deliberately. A signature concluded what months of careful erosion had prepared. It gathered every rumour, every statement, every document into a single point of consequence. Once ink touched parchment, the process was sealed. The estate no longer answered to him. The future of his children drifted toward structures he would not control. His reputation slipped from salvageable to settled. The very symbol of authority, his written name, became the tool that finalized his displacement. It was astonishing how fragile permanence proved to be. The fields outside continued to sway under the same wind that had shaped them for generations. The hearth still glowed in the great hall. Servants moved through corridors with their usual efficiency. Nothing around him bore the marks of collapse. Yet he understood that something irreversible had shifted. The structures supporting his life had not fallen, but tilted so far that recovery was impossible. Those present during the signing did not fully grasp its weight. Clerks saw only the procedure. Legal representatives noticed completion rather than devastation. The wife's relatives observed, with composed expressions, their victory hidden behind a veneer of dignity. Even the mistress, if she heard of it at all, would know only that the story had reached its final chapter. Only he perceived how profoundly the moment hollowed out the ground beneath him. He remembered the years when authority felt natural to him, when people sought his approval, when decisions moved outward from him like ripples, when servants followed his rhythm without hesitation. Now, those memories felt distant, softened by the knowledge that leadership had always been temporary. The signing did not erase what he had accomplished, but it stripped those accomplishments of their lasting influence. The legal language on the parchment reduced his life into clauses and conditions. It documented responsibilities he could no longer fulfill, assets he no longer controlled, and relationships restructured beyond his involvement. The law spoke plainly, without sentiment, without acknowledging the human weight behind each line. It was indifferent to how he felt, to what he regretted. to what he wished he had changed. The structure of authority mattered more than the man living within it. He signed because refusal would not alter the outcome. He signed because the law required it. He signed because no one stood beside him anymore. Not allies. Not family. Not even those who once benefited from his generosity. The sound of the quill scratching across the parchment felt louder than thunder, even though the room remained still. When the final document was sealed, the chamber emptied. No one lingered. No one offered comfort. The formality of the moment ended quickly. As though closure mattered less than efficiency, the clerk gathered the papers. The legal representatives bowed politely before departing. The door closed with a soft click, leaving him in the quiet aftermath of a life redefined. He stepped into the corridor, noticing how unchanged everything appeared. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Dust drifted lazily in its glow. The air smelled faintly of wax and stone. Yet familiarity now felt like a cruel echo. He recognized every detail, but nothing belonged to him in the way it once had. He was present, yet peripheral. Walking through the great hall deepened this sensation. The carved beams overhead, the tapestries depicting ancestors, the long table, worn smooth by generations. These signs of continuity no longer reflected him. They continued their existence effortlessly, while his own place among them dimmed. Servants greeted him with courtesy, shaped more by habit than loyalty. Their expressions revealed nothing. Yet he sensed the subtle recalibration that accompanied his loss of authority. They now answered to someone else. Even if that transition had not yet been formally declared, their obedience became procedural, not personal. He paused near the threshold of the hall and listened. The silence was not empty. It was indifferent. And indifference, he understood, was far more devastating than contempt. Contempt demanded energy. Indifference required only distance. The estate remained intact, but the lineage shifted quietly underneath it. The direction of inheritance had changed. The influence of the wife's family strengthened. Titles would be amended. Guardianship restructured. What had once seemed stable revealed itself as conditional. He thought of the generations before him, of the expectations laid upon him from birth, of the confidence he once felt in the solidity of his role. Those expectations felt almost naive now. Power did not endure through strength alone. It endured through perception. And perception had turned away from him long before he signed the parchment. Night approached gently, the quiet deepening as candles flickered against stone walls. Shadows stretched across the floor, elongated and soft. He felt himself mirrored in those shadows, distorted at the edges, fading toward the dim corners. He did not feel vanished, only thinned. He lay awake later, contemplating futures he would not shape, children who would be raised under guidance he no longer provided, decisions made in rooms he would not enter, alliances formed without his knowledge. None of it felt sudden. Decline rarely was. It settled slowly, like dust gathering in untouched corners. The truth revealed itself with calm finality. A lineage altered requires no battle. A downfall requires no executioner. A signature, placed with a steady hand, can dismantle an entire world. And as you rest tonight, let your breathing slow as the halls of that fading estate recede into the quiet. Let the softness of the dark settle around you like a cloak. May sleep take you gently, carrying these old Tudor shadows into softer places where they cannot trouble your dreams. Good night.